And I'm going to invite Cecile to come up to the front and join Sarah. And I believe we'll be bringing Dr. Shork up if we can on the video. If not, we'll have you on audio. And we're going to open this panel, this session, up for questions to the speakers. Please.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Alex Biela. I'm the head of regulatory affairs for Nestle Health Science. I bring medical food back to the table, but just to set the context of my question, as my intent is not really to discuss medical food here. But I agree with Professor Zeisel that medical food is a potential category for the classification of some of these concepts that we saw here today. I say potential because we do have to recognize the current narrow interpretation adopted by FDA that could somehow leave some of these concepts in a regulatory limbo. As said, this is the context. My question to the panel is the following. When we see a disruptive frontier like we saw today that really challenge at least the way we understand nutrition, and even these new ways to measure the impact of the nutritional interventions like the real-world evidence and the N1 studies. My question is how to balance the necessary oversight from the government and the control over these developments, either from food safety perspective or for communication, and they needed to have regulations that really keep a long-term outlook, foster innovation, and allow all these concepts to reach those that really need these products the most.
Is that one for me? I think that right now is about as favorable an environment for bringing those kinds of questions to FDA as we've had in a number of years. The previous speaker covered some of that. I think what we've seen with the 23andMe clearance shows some creativity. There have been other developments on the food side. For example, the health claim that was cleared earlier this year concerning a food allergen, which is not the kind of health condition that we previously had health claims cleared for. So the environment is right, but it's important to have really a particular request that you want the agency to respond to. I think that there is a concern.
Yeah, this is Nick Shork. Maybe I could just embellish that a little bit. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Yeah, I was going to say, one thing that is pretty clear is not a whole lot of time has elapsed, say, since the introduction of the 21st Century Cures Act, for people to come up with, say, paradigmatic study designs or ways of collecting data in the real world that might pass muster at the FDA. So the fact that you don't see a whole lot of examples that you could challenge or maybe extend just has to do with that fact. But my experience is, and I'm not an apologist for the FDA, I've just been involved in clinical studies where we've had to have extended conversations with them about some of the design issues I talked about. They're eager and willing to listen to the scientific community, more so than I think they had been in the past, because they want to stay abreast of all these technological developments. So, for example, it is possible now to actually register digital therapeutics with the FDA. So apps on phones, you can register as a health technology, and if they pass muster, they can be approved for use as a health technology, such that they could be prescribed by physicians instead of pills. So, there's a lot of really forward thinking goes on, and I agree with Sarah that the time is exceptional for people to put forward kind of creative ideas about vetting things. Of course, the data is going to have to pass muster, but there's a lot of receptivity for novel ideas.
Cecile, did you want to comment? Okay, please, your question.
Sure. Ahmed El-Sohemi, University of Toronto. Just a couple of brief comments and then a question to Dr. Jansen. First of all, just to clarify the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, you're right that they are updating the position paper, but they have formally withdrawn it. And that's their term, and that means they've taken it off their website and they've removed it. Although, funny enough, because it is published in a journal, it's still available on PubMed, and you can't. It hasn't disappeared, but it has disappeared from their website. Yeah, and so I'm also glad that to see you highlight the flaws or criticisms of the Pavlidis paper in Omics. And there have been a couple of letters to the editor. In fact, some have argued that that paper should even be retracted because it's not even a meta-analysis, even though it's in the title. So just like we can't call a case report an RCT, you can't call a review paper a meta-analysis. But in addition to that and all the criticisms that you've highlighted, there's a litany of other ones that also suggest that it's an extreme bias that was self-serving by a group of, I believe, they're pharmacogeneticists, and they have their funding agenda, which is another topic of discussion. But I was, I guess, a bit surprised that you used as kind of an example of the right way to do things by using 23andMe, using
Surprised myself too. I've criticized them a lot in the past 10 years,
Sure.
and I found myself surprised.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not asking you to criticize them. It's just, as you know, that's based on the older data that now is no longer available, at least to those in the U.S. Myself being in Canada, I still have access to that kind of health information. But as you know, those were all based on disease association studies and not so much kind of the metabolic and modifier genes. The comment about the ApoE, maybe just another last comment, is we've actually, from the company, have been asked by practitioners to provide ApoE testing. They're like, why don't you offer that? And we specifically decided not to include that in the panel because of the ApoE aspect. So it's good to see that now there is some consideration for these unintended consequences. Even though it might predict response to blood lipids, it does have this other consequence where perhaps it might not be actionable. So my question, finally, I think I have one somewhere, is really to both of you, and I think we've heard a lot throughout the day about genetics and different kinds of genetic tests and criteria for validity and clinical utility of genetic testing. But I've always viewed this as really being a nutrition issue predominantly, if you're looking at the right markers. So perhaps to you, Cecile, what kind of evidence, you mentioned you're a skeptic, what kind of evidence would you like to see that would convince you that A, this is really a nutrition issue and perhaps someone like a registered dietitian should be taking the reins on this kind of information, but what kind of evidence would you see as satisfying your need to say this is now available and should be used?
So I give you my answer, and that is maybe totally in disagreement with many others. But first, let me first come back to 23andMe, because I have criticized 23andMe a lot in the past years. And most of the time when they were presenting those health risks because, of the limited predictability. But I have mentioned them here because of the transparency, that they are so clear in saying your risk needs to be updated. There's a lot of educational material. They also say this is what, that was how when they first started, this is what science at this moment knows about your genes. May change tomorrow, when we learn more. I remember that my thrombosis risk decreases overnight from 24% to 9%, just because they found sex-specific incidence rates. So first they had a general risk and population risk based for men and women together, and then they split it up. And so my risk for thrombosis, venous thrombosis, decreased overnight. But that is a transparency that I like. I'm not saying that I like everything of it. So what kind of evidence do I want? I was, during this day, I was thinking, we should maybe get together and define some minimum criteria, because I feel that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what is proper evidence. I'm not saying that what I think is the way to go, but for me, it doesn't stop with demonstrating a robust gene-diet outcome association. That is one thing. I think that's a start, the basis for maybe a personalized recommendation, but you need to show that changing a diet really compensates that genetic disadvantage. So if you have a certain genotype that increases your blood pressure more than with another genotype, then you need to demonstrate that by changing the diet, you can lower it to make it similar to the others. And then you can, of course, go on and say, okay, does that need to be an RCT? Well, I think let's just start with observational. And if the observational data looks convincing, it is nutrition, it's not really health. It's not, I would start with observational. And then when we have sufficient observational evidence, then let's see whether we still need the RCTs. Because the field is changing so much that by the time you finish your RCT, your field has already moved on. So you can't keep up with that. What I don't, sorry, I'll make it short. What I don't need is this relationship with the clinical outcomes. So I think we have enough evidence out there about certain clinical risk factors in relation to tons of the diseases that I do not need those long studies that not only show change in diet and all the way to the clinical outcome. No, if you can show that the intermediate factor, robustly changes, for me that's enough. But I may be in disagreement with the rest of the audience.
Thank you.
Did you want to comment, Sarah?
I would just encourage people who are interested to have a look at the recent FDA clearance of 23andMe. There were some of the tests that they were marketing that were subject to the warning letter that were not part of this approval for safety reasons. But the evidence that the agency looked at convinced the agency that there is a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. So that is, the test isn't hazardous, it's the information coming out of the test that was being considered there. And it doesn't cover that next step to nutrition. But there, I would focus on the competent and reliable scientific evidence standard, because in the absence of a different standard being articulated in the statute, FDA does have a tendency to look to FTC standards on substantiation.
Leela Saldana with the Office of Dietary Supplements. I had a little bit of an aha moment with your presentation. So currently, the way West regulation is structured, we have definitions, and we put things very neatly into boxes with boundaries. So we have a definition for foods, we have a definition for dietary supplements, and the agency is structured that way. So we have, devices and biologics and drugs. And what we've been talking about all day today is sort of a systems approach where, you have testing that leads to this and leads to this and leads to this, but we don't have a regulatory system that puts those puzzle pieces together, or an agency that's sort of structured to deal with the holistic approach. So the question is, one of the challenges moving forward is, how do we manage this from a regulatory perspective when the regulatory system is not set up to handle it? Am I making sense?
Yes, and boy, I love it when someone asks me a question like that. What I want to leave as a takeaway on this whole issue is just that, we're very accustomed to having FDA interpret its statute in a particular way. But the fact of the matter is that this is just a general principle of administrative law, that when an agency is interpreting its own statute, the courts will give a good bit of deference to the agency. So if the agency's been going along interpreting it one way and then decides, the world is changing, we need to come up with a different approach, that's okay. They can change their approach. They just need to justify why they were going this way and now they're going to go here. Okay? There's some flexibility, and I wanted to emphasize the amount of flexibility and the authority the agency does have to be creative. So I don't have the answer for exactly how to do it, but I think that this is an exciting discussion today, because I think that it shows that some really good outcomes can result if we can have a more flexible approach.
And just another very, very minor point. In all the discussion about medical foods, as you know, There is no format for medical food labeling. There's no format for, so you package the product. Like dietary supplements or conventional foods, there is a format for how you should label the product, which it doesn't exist for medical foods. The other thing with medical foods is that there is no generic term for medical food, so the term medical food doesn't appear on a product that is intended to be a medical food. And I wonder why that we don't have that generic term to distinguish a true medical food, because in the marketplace, a lot of things are called medical foods that don't meet the definition of a medical food. But if a consumer's looking at a package,
Right.
they can't tell because it doesn't say medical food like it says dietary supplement. Or,
True.
there is no. So,
Well, there's only one kind of food that is required to say what it is on the label, and that's a dietary supplement. All the other ones, what's important is that the product meet the requirements for that kind of food. And I guess I'll kind of go back to what I said earlier. When it comes to labeling and claims, FDA has a lot of flexibility in its approach on medical foods. So, there's sometimes not having something well defined is actually a good thing.
thank you.
Please.
Chris Lynch at the Office of Nutrition Research at NIH. So we heard today there's a number of SNPs or alleles that seem like would be very beneficial if people knew that they had those or not. But at a lot of medical centers in the country now, maybe all of the patients are being asked to provide their DNA and and I'm aware of several medical centers that are doing whole exome sequencing and then banking this data with the hopes of data mining it and things like that. And is it ethical not to provide that information back to the patients? Since they went in the first place for medical care and not research. But I think my impression is that a lot of this information is being stored for research purposes and intellectual property and things like that.
So you're asking, is it ethical to not give it back?
Yeah. Should we be? Should that be, since it's not since a number of people here presented opinions that this could be of value to people's health. Mm-hmm. But my impression is this information is being collected.
Data data is collected, not information.
It's genetic information. It's
sequencing.
It's my impression it's not. It's being, it's not being given back mm-hmm. to the people who mm-hmm. provided it.
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I'm not sure whether it is ethical or not ethical to not do it. Sorry that I interrupted you, but there is when we start sequencing, we start collecting data. It's only information when we start interpreting it, and sometimes we can do that automatically by algorithms. Sometimes the doctor specialist needs to look at it. Is it ethical not to give it back? Is it ethical to give something back that the person has no idea what to do with it? So I think in healthcare, doctors should give answers to questions and not just answers. But that's a personal.
Yeah. I'd like to offer a perspective. One of the things, when I was talking about the litigation, notice that Social Security numbers and genetic information at this point in time are kind of being handled in the same way. It's like, well, we're early in the process, but under existing law at the federal level, it's, well, make sure that the consumer knows what they're getting into, disclose all the material facts. So I have a question in my mind, is genetic information the same as a Social Security number, or is it something more significant? One thing that happens at the state level. See, we have the practice of medicine at the state level that's being regulated under medical practice acts. Other, nurses, dietitians, and there are codes of medical ethics and other codes of ethics, and it's because these sorts of issues have historically been handled within the relationship of a doctor-patient, where the doctor has an ethical obligation to serve the interests only of the patient. So now what we've done is we've taken testing and we're putting it in a different place, and we don't have any legal framework to control those ethical issues. But I will say that, in those complaints I mentioned, people are mentioning issues related to property rights. Do I have property rights? I mean, it's not settled right now, but I do think it's an issue that does deserve, further consideration.
If I may want to add something.
You get the last comment.
Thank you so much. The American College of Medical Geneticists has come up with a list of variants that need to be returned when people undergo sequencing. And these are what they call actionable mutations, like, for example, the BRCA mutations for breast cancer. I do not know what the current standard of those criteria is. They first had a list of 56 genes, and then they revised it. But that was the plan, that if people undergo sequencing, that there is a default list that will be returned because the patient can benefit from it.
Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking the speakers.